Historical records from the late 19th century describe a landscape of boundless ambition, but by the autumn of 1886, that ambition had become a death trap. To understand the magnitude of the catastrophe that was about to unfold, one must first understand the state of the American West at this exact moment in time. The cattle industry was at its absolute zenith. The plains of Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas were choked with millions of head of livestock. Driven by the beef bonanza and fueled by Eastern and British capital, the range was dangerously overstocked. The summer of 1886 had been blisteringly hot and bone-dry, leaving the prairie grasses parched and stunted. The cattle were already entering the cold months malnourished, their ribs showing through dusty hides. Then the first frost arrived, not as a seasonal transition, but as a warning. On the night of January 9, 1887, the threshold was crossed. A Siberian cold front descended from the north with a violence that modern meteorology still struggles to categorize. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted, falling 60 degrees in a matter of hours. This was the birth of the whiteout blizzard, a meteorological phenomenon where the horizon vanishes and the world becomes a claustrophobic cage of swirling crystalline ice. For the lone rancher or the cowboy caught in a line camp, this wasn't just weather, it was an existential threat. Imagine the physical sensation of air so cold that it crystallizes the moisture in your nostrils instantly, turning every breath into a series of jagged internal cuts. This was a 60 below zero reality, where the very concept of shelter became a thin, flickering line between a legacy and a frozen grave. The technical danger of this historical moment lay in the ground blizzard. In the 1880s, without satellite tracking or radio warnings, a man's only barometer was the behavior of the wind and the look of the sky. When the gale force winds hit, they picked up the dry, powdery snow from the parched earth, mixing it with falling ice to create a wall of white that was impenetrable to human sight. Ranchers documented cases of men getting lost and freezing to death just 10 feet from their own front doors, unable to find the latch in a world that had lost all its dimensions. The cattle, driven by a primal instinct to escape the wind, began to drift south by the thousands. But they were met by the greatest technological innovation of the era: barbed wire. The devil's rope, as it was called, meant the cattle could no longer migrate to find shelter in the coulees. They piled up against the fences, shivering, their breath freezing into masks of ice over their eyes until they simply stopped moving. This was the beginning of the end for the open range, and for the men trapped within it, the fight for the next hour was the only history that mattered. Before we dive deeper into the archives of the past, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? The brutal reality of the 1880s dictated that survival was not merely a matter of raw courage, but a meticulous management of finite resources. While the storm outside transformed the plains into an ivory wasteland, inside the log cabins and sod houses, time seemed to collapse. For the 19th century frontiersman, daily life was a succession of tactile rituals. To understand this moment, we must look at the forgotten customs of those forced to transform their humble dwellings into fortresses against oblivion. Historical records from this era show that forced isolation fundamentally shifted a man's relationship with his possessions. Every tool possessed a soul. The rhythmic rasp of a whetstone against the high-carbon steel of a skinning knife was not merely maintenance, it was a manual prayer against impotence. In small, one-room shacks, the atmosphere was a dense olfactory archive. The pungent scent of burning pine, the heavy musk of beef tallow used to waterproof leather boots, and the sharp metallic tang of iron tools being heated near the hearth. The archive of life for these men was contained within their wooden trunks, a weathered Bible, letters from loved ones in the East that no longer felt real, and the precious hoard of coffee beans, often crushed by hand with the butt of a knife on a scrap of canvas. The history of the everyday during the Great Die-Up reveals an ingenuity born of sheer desperation. When fuel for the cast iron stove, usually timber or buffalo chips, began to dwindle, ranchers were forced into harrowing decisions. Contemporary accounts describe men dismantling handmade furniture, shelving, and even internal structural beams to keep the fire from dying. The fire was more than heat. It was the light that kept insanity at bay. Without it, the darkness of the winter plains was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to press against the very walls of the home. The diet of these pioneers during weeks of sequestration was a testament to resilience. Sourdough starter was a constant companion, often kept close to the rancher's body heat at night to prevent it from freezing and dying. Game meat, preserved by the intense cold, was sliced into thin ribbons and boiled exhaustively to extract every drop of fat, the biological fuel necessary to stave off hypothermia. Every meal was consumed in a heavy silence, a vivid contrast to the boisterous summers of roundups and communal labor. In this chapter of human existence, wisdom resided in that silence. The psychological pressure of hearing the wind shriek for days on end, at a frequency that mimicked human screams, tested the threshold of sanity. Men occupied their minds with the obsessive repair of leather saddles and harnesses, even while knowing their horses might already be dead beneath 10 feet of drifted snow. The touch of cold, stiff leather and the strain of pushing a bone needle through cured hide served as a sensory anchor. They were preserving the equipment for a future that, with each passing hour, felt less likely. This was the weight of memories, the contrast between a frozen, stagnant present and the memory of August sun over healthy herds. Every stitch in the leather was an act of faith that spring still existed somewhere beyond that merciless white wall. To truly grasp the horror of the winter of 1886, one must analyze the impact of geographic isolation on the psyche of the pioneer. In the modern world, we are never truly unreachable. In 1887, being cut off was a literal physical severance from the human species. Historical documentation suggests that the cabin fever experienced during this winter was not merely boredom, but a profound psychological fracturing. When the horizon vanishes for weeks at a time, the human brain loses its sense of scale and direction. The harsh reality of the 1880s meant that a rancher's social fabric was fragile to begin with. Most line camps were manned by 2 men at most, and often by a single, solitary soul. Under the weight of the great white silence, the sound of one's own voice became a haunting reminder of the vast emptiness outside. Records from the era frequently mention men talking to their dogs, their tools, or even the shadows on the wall just to verify their own existence. The isolation was not just spatial, it was temporal. Without the sun to mark the passage of hours, the day became a singular, agonizing now. The geographical reality of the northern plains, vast, treeless and flat, meant there was no visual relief. The whiteout effect created a sensory deprivation chamber of epic proportions. This isolation led to a phenomenon known as snow blindness, where the glare of the ice literally burned the corneas, but the psychological blindness was even more devastating. Pioneers reported a feeling of vanishing into the landscape. To be alone against the world in 1886 was to face the realization that the universe was entirely indifferent to your survival. Psychologically, the most grueling aspect was the weight. Ranchers knew their cattle were dying by the thousands just miles away, but to step outside was certain death. This forced passivity, the inability to protect one's livelihood, crushed the spirit of men who defined themselves by their action and utility. They were masters of the range, reduced to shivering captives of the atmosphere. The isolation forced a deep, often painful introspection. In the flickering light of a tallow candle, a man had to confront his own failures, his regrets, and the terrifying possibility that the American dream of the West was nothing more than a frozen mirage. The strength required to maintain one's mind in such a vacuum is perhaps the greatest, most overlooked sacrifice of the frontier. As February 1887 bled into March, the atmosphere of the northern plains shifted from a silent, crystalline prison to a theater of visceral carnage. The breaking point was not a single moment, but a harrowing climax where the limits of human and animal endurance finally buckled under the weight of an unprecedented catastrophe. For the Cowboys trapped in the line camps of the Montana and Wyoming territories, the climax of this winter was defined by a desperate, final attempt to salvage the remnants of their world, or simply to survive the transition from a frozen purgatory to a flooded graveyard. Historical records from this era describe the Chinook wind, a warm, dry breath from the mountains, as both a savior and a harbinger of horror. When the temperatures finally rose above freezing, the reality of the big die-up was unmasked. As the 10-foot drifts began to recede, the landscape revealed a sight that no veteran of the frontier had ever witnessed. The plains were not covered in grass, but in a carpet of carcasses. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must visualize the barbed wire climax. Thousands of cattle, driven by a primal urge to seek warmth, had drifted for hundreds of miles until they hit the drift fences. There, unable to move forward and too weak to turn back, they had stacked up against the wire, freezing in grotesque upright positions. The breaking point for the ranchers came when they finally forced their cabin doors open, only to find the whiteout had been replaced by a blackout of death. Men, who had spent months in psychological isolation, now faced a physical task that was Herculean in its despair. The act of final bravery was not found in a gunfight, but in the gruesome labor of the skinning camps. Knowing their herds were wiped out and their financial futures evaporated, many cowboys spent their last remaining strength skinning the frozen carcasses of the animals they had spent years protecting. In the 1880s, a hide was worth a few dollars, a pittance compared to a live steer, but it was the only currency left in a bankrupt land. The sensory immersion of this climax was overwhelming. The sound of the thaw was not the gentle trickle of spring, but the roar of ice-choked rivers overflowing with the bodies of drowned livestock. The air, once purified by the 60-below cold, now carried the heavy, cloying scent of mass decay as the sun hit the rotting hides. Ranchers described walking for miles on the backs of dead cows without ever touching the ground. This was the raw, powerful end of an era. The breaking point was the realization that the open range, the mythic fence-free West, had been slaughtered by the very climate that had once promised it riches. In these final hours of the storm's grip, we see the true nature of the pioneer spirit. It was a resilience born of necessity, but executed with the gravity of a funeral rite. Cowboys, their hands cracked and bleeding from the combination of frostbite and the caustic fluids of the thaw, worked until they collapsed. They weren't just working for money anymore. They were clearing the stage for a new world. The sacrifice was total. The beef bonanza was dead, and as the last of the great blizzards dissipated, the men of the West stood among the ruins of their empire, realizing that to survive the frontier, they would have to fundamentally change how they lived upon it. As the catastrophic melt of 1887 began in earnest, the American West was not merely thawing, it was being reborn in a baptism of mud and bone. The historical aftermath of the winter that killed 1 million cattle was a period of grim accounting, a physical and financial autopsy of a dream that had frozen to death. Historical records from the spring of 1887 describe a silence that was perhaps more haunting than the winter's roar, the silence of a prairie stripped of its heartbeat. To understand this moment, we must look at the Great Die-Up, not just as a weather event, but as the definitive structural collapse of the frontier economy. The harsh reality of the 1880s meant that wealth was measured in hooves and horns, and by April, that wealth was floating down the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers. The aftermath was a sensory assault of industrial proportions. Ranchers reported that the stench of rotting carcasses was so pervasive it could be smelled from miles away, a literal miasma of failure hanging over the territories. The geographical reality of the plains, once seen as an endless pasture, was now revealed to be a fragile ecosystem pushed beyond its breaking point. The open range model, where cattle were left to fending for themselves on public lands, was proven to be a fatal gamble. The data from this era is staggering. Some ranches reported losses of 90 to 95% of their herds. Prestigious cattle companies backed by European aristocrats and Wall Street tycoons folded overnight. One of the most famous figures of the era, a young Theodore Roosevelt, lost nearly his entire investment in the Badlands. He would later reflect that the romance of the West died in those drifts. The aftermath forced a radical shift in the history of the everyday. Survivors realized that to remain on this land, they could no longer be nomads of the grass. They had to become farmers of the hay. This period saw the death of the cattle king and the birth of the stock grower. The customs of the 1880s, the reliance on vast unfenced distances, were replaced by the necessity of winter feeding, irrigation, and sheltered pens. The acceptance of destiny was a bitter pill for the lone ranchers. They had to trade their absolute freedom for the security of infrastructure. The aftermath was also a moment of profound human displacement. Thousands of cowboys, the icons of the American myth, found themselves unemployed and wandering a landscape that no longer required their specific brand of reckless courage. In the great tapestry of history, the winter of 1886-1887 serves as the jagged line where the Wild West began to be tamed. The aftermath was the realization that nature does not negotiate. The survivors who stayed did so with a new, hardened wisdom. They were no longer masters of the wilderness. They were its stewards, operating with a deep-seated fear of the sky that would be passed down through generations. When the dust finally settled and the last carcasses were cleared or reclaimed by the earth, the West was smaller, fenced, and humbled. But it was also more resilient, built on the hard-won lessons of those who had watched their world vanish into the white. To gaze upon the vast rolling prairies of the American West today is to look upon a landscape defined by the ghosts of 1887. The legacy of the Great White Silence is not merely found in the history books or the dusty archives of the Montana Historical Society. It is etched into the very soil, the wire, and the bloodlines of those who still call this unforgiving earth their home. As we conduct our final documentary analysis of this era, we must recognize that the catastrophe of the 1880s was the crucible that forged the modern American spirit, a spirit born from the literal ashes of a frozen empire. Historical records from the decades following the Big Die-Up show a profound shift in the human relationship with the wild. The rugged individualism that defined the early pioneers was tempered by a new, communal understanding of survival. The harsh reality of the 1880s taught a lesson that resonates through the centuries, that nature is not an enemy to be conquered, but a force to be respected. The legacy of those lone ranchers, men who sat in dark cabins listening to the death of their dreams, is one of quiet, terrifying resilience. They did not simply endure the cold, they absorbed its lessons and rebuilt a world that was more sustainable, more cautious, and ultimately more permanent. In the grand tapestry of human history, the winter of 1886-1887 stands as a monument to the history of the everyday hero. These were men who didn't seek the glory of the gunfight, but the quiet dignity of the survivor. They faced the psychological isolation of a world turned white and the physical agony of a landscape turned to ice. Their sacrifice ensured that the West would not remain a playground for reckless speculation, but would become a home for those with the grit to tend it. To understand this moment is to understand the true cost of the American dream. It was paid for in 60 below-zero breaths and the silence of 1 million cattle. Today, we look back at those pioneers with a sense of awe, not for their dominance, but for their refusal to break. The Wildbound spirit is not about being untamable. It is about finding the strength to remain when everything else has been stripped away. We honor those who refuse to let the fire die, those who kept the sourdough warm against their skin, and those who stood among the carcasses of the spring and chose to plant hay instead of moving on. Their resilience is the foundation upon which the modern world was built, a testament to the fact that while the storm may change the map, it can never erase the legacy of those who dared to face it. As the sun sets over the modern range, the fences they built still stand as a reminder of the winter that changed everything. The story of 1886 is a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It is a living document, a cautionary tale, and a source of infinite inspiration. We are the inheritors of their endurance, and by remembering their names and their struggles, we ensure that their fire never truly goes out. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us at Wildbound History. If you believe these stories of resilience must never be forgotten, hit the like button and subscribe for our next historical journey. Until next time, stay wild.